Welcome, everybody. Last class, we were talking about the music of the Romantic period, and we will continue with the big guns, the superheroes of orchestral music in the Romantic period. We talked about Schubert already, and we talked about Schubert in relation to the art song, or the Lied in German. And please know that Schubert composed symphonies. His symphonies certainly in the classical, more conservative vein than we're going to look at this evening, but he did compose symphonies. And again, we looked at Chopin and Liszt, the Romantic piano. And we talked about Liszt and his contributions to some very interesting works of the Romantic period in regard to the orchestra. Very radical composer on the radical side of things there. And tonight, we're going to go with actually two tonight, and then the next class we'll do two more. We're going to go with Hector Berlioz, a French composer, Modest Mussorgsky, a Russian composer, Tchaikovsky, a Russian composer, and Antonin Dvorak. So we're going to of the Czech Republic. So we're going to visit France and Russia and the Czech Republic. So we talked about already the rise of nationalism, and this is going to be a very good introduction to how composers are composing music that is native to their particular country. But first, let me talk about orchestral music in general in the Romantic period. Of course, we're going to stick with that genre of the symphony. We've had it now for quite some time, but we're going to see some composers will choose to write still in the genre of the symphony. We call that absolute music, music that is self-contained, and the form is that of the symphony. And the other side of the coin, that's the more conservative view, that of the symphony. What's going on within it might be very interesting and expressive, but for the most part, that form, very conservative. The other side of the coin is the more radical orchestral music of the Romantic period, the unconventional forms, the program music of the time. Tonight we're actually going to combine program music and the genre of the symphony, so we're really going to be confused. But there are other unconventional forms. Tchaikovsky wrote an overture fantasy. He gave it two names, an overture fantasy. To what? To Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet, overture fantasy. It is a one-movement piece of music based on that wonderful piece of literature we all know and love, Romeo and Juliet. And we also have what's called a tone poem, or also a symphonic poem. One movement as far as a tone poem goes. And for example, Strauss wrote a tone poem called Don Juan. Again, it is a one-movement work that is self-contained, and it is the story in music of Don Juan. So, now, with all this expression going on in the Romantic period, composers don't want to be bound to rules. Some do. Some want those rules within, the genre of the symphony, but some are going to break free from those rules. And that's what the Romantic period was about, getting away from that. And so we're going to look at, specifically, tonight we're going to look at Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. A symphony, yes, but it also has an incredible story to it. So on one hand, it has that conservative form, but on the other hand, it's going to blow you away. 1830, 3 years after Beethoven's death, and here we have this monumental piece of music. We will also look at others as well. But I want to start with Hector Berlioz. Let me scroll down for you here. Hector Berlioz, 1803 to 1869, one of the first French Romantic composers. And he was a very daring creator of new orchestral sounds. And we're going to look at his monumental work, Symphonie Fantastique, again, written 3 years after Beethoven's death. Born in a small town in France outside of Grenoble, his father sent him to Paris to study medicine, but Berlioz was filled with horror and I guess passed out in the dissecting room, so they knew that medicine was not going to be a career for young Hector. And it didn't take long for Berlioz to learn. Certainly Paris was an incredible place to be, right? And he studied at the Paris Conservatory. He analyzed musical scores, anything he could get his hands on. He haunted the opera house, and he was enticed by Shakespeare. He was an avid lover of Shakespeare, and of course we're going to see how that ends up in his music as well. He memorized many operas, which I think is interesting. I don't know many people who do memorize operas. He memorized operas and became furious with conductors that tampered with its orchestration. And he would actually stand up in a performance and say, "Why did you do that? It's supposed to be 2 piccolos, not 3, or blah, blah, blah. What are you adding instruments for? Why are you tampering with the orchestration?" And you laugh, ah ha ha ha. But, you see, he was a daring orchestrator. And so knowing, being the genius that he was, knowing all the inner workings of all these operas, certainly combined with his fiery personality, we really have something interesting going on. When he was 23, when he was in his early 20s, again, just absolutely in love with the works of Shakespeare. And this was very common during the Romantic period. The emphasis on the literary. Literary works will end up within musical works, right? We've seen that already. I've talked about Tchaikovsky, Romeo and Juliet. And we'll see that these literary creations are going to end up as great inspiration for Romantic composers. Berlioz was, one night, I believe, watching Hamlet. And it was a wonderful English theatrical company that was in town, that was in Paris. And there was an actress up on stage. Her name was Harriet Smithson, British actress. And he fell in love with her. He fell in love with her. Did he meet her? No. But he fell in love with her. He wrote her letters constantly. In this day and age, we would call it stalking. Help me, 911. This guy fell deeply in love with Harriet Smithson, wrote her wild and impassioned letters, and of course she thought he was a lunatic and refused to see him. He grieved. If she could for one moment conceive all the poetry, all the infinity of such love, she would fly into my arms. Instead, well, she left Paris without even meeting him. But that will come later. Berlioz wins a prize, the Prix de Rome. And this enabled him as a composer to go over to Rome and compose. And he would certainly be subsidized financially for doing this. To depict his, and I quote, endless and unquenchable passion, Berlioz comes out in 1830 with a 5-movement symphony based on the dreams and the passions of an opium-induced artist who is absolutely desperate about his love that he doesn't have. Of course, it's not Berlioz. It's not him, right? No, no, no. I don't think so. Let's try to unlock that mystery now. So, he has this award, he composes this symphony, and when she realized, eventually, that this music was about her, she said this: she felt the room reel about her. She heard no more, but sat in a dream. The next day, they met. And a year later, they were married. They separated after a few years. Okay, so we have the little outlines here of something really strange. But if you know Berlioz and his fiery temperament, people thought, explain the guy as just looking kind of crazy, you know, as well, that he was absolutely crazy. And of course, explaining this being in love with somebody you have never met in letters and stuff like that, what do we call that? Fatal attraction, oh my goodness. And that's what this was, basically. It's the Fatal Attraction Symphony. Berlioz's unconventional music. Now we're going to talk about how his music is unconventional. The first thing I will say is he was a daring orchestrator. as far as combining instruments, as far as wanting a huge sound. We thought Beethoven's Ninth was huge. This is huge, this five-movement symphony. Berlioz actually had to arrange concerts at his own expense because nobody really wanted to hear him at first. And of course, you had to hire musicians and you had to do so much, and it really financially and physically drained him. And he said this: "The main reason for the long war against me," he wrote, "lies in the antagonism existing between my musical feeling and that of the great mass of the Parisian public." He complained that all music off the beaten track seemed to these people the music of madness. And this symphony, my friends, kind of was. But you know, people were used to what? You know, we have the Mozart, we have the Beethoven, you know, we have this beautiful music of Schubert, and then we have this. What is this? And of course, that shock can turn an audience away. I mean, how many of you have been to concerts and just kind of gone, oh my God, you know, but I sat through it and it's okay, right? And so eventually, of course, his music will grow very quickly to fame. But of course, it didn't happen quickly. To support his family, Berlioz turned to musical journalism. And he was a wonderful writer. As a matter of fact, his memoirs actually read like a romance novel. It's a wonderful thing to read, Berlioz's memoirs. And he was one of the most brilliant and witty music critics who ever lived. And so that was to supplement his crazy musicianship that people didn't want to hear, but he kept with it and he kept at it. Outside France, if you can believe this, things were different for Berlioz. Liszt directed a German orchestra in several of what I say Berlioz weeks. Liszt liked his music. Liszt promoted his music. And that's one of the great things about Liszt as well, is that he rallied for new music and composers. And so after 1840, his works were actually in demand. And he was also, he was one of the first great orchestral conductors. And there are actually pictures, not pictures, but paintings, or caricatures, I should say, of Berlioz conducting. Just an absolute maniac, as you can surely imagine with his temperament and all you've heard about him, that he was a wild conductor. And someday, some of you might see me conduct. I'm sure you can imagine the same thing, right? His later years, unfortunately, were not so great. He was repeatedly passed over for major conducting positions, and really, he composed very little. And so, this piece of music is a groundbreaker, people. 1830, Symphonie Fantastique, a five-movement. Now, right there should say something to you immediately. 5 movements, right? We haven't heard that yet. We haven't heard that. We have heard 4 movements. But again, we're going into some unconventional areas. And let me remind you again of that quote from Mr. Berlioz from the beginning. "The prevailing qualities of my music are passionate expressiveness, inner fire, rhythmic drive, and unexpectedness." And in this symphony, that's certainly what you have. But when you combine the low strings and the woodwinds and the snarling brass and the rumbling percussions and tempo changes and romantic expression, you also have this underlying program. Hence, this is called a program symphony. We combine the genre of the symphony with program music, right? We talked about what program music is, remember? Music associated with a non-musical idea. I've defined it at least 2 or 3 times now. For example, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, right? It's a piece of music that has to do with a non-musical idea. And so, what a non-musical idea we have here, huh? Okay. All right. Berlioz's compositions are full of long melodies, unexpected turns, exactly what he says. To critics that actually thought that Berlioz's music lacked melody, which I think is interesting, to deny their existence is unfair and absurd, but as they are often on a large scale, an immature or unappreciative mind cannot appreciate their forms. So he was very upset about not being called a great lyricist. Most of his works are for orchestra, as we're going to see one of his major ones. He invented a new form, and I'll just throw it out here. There's no reason to write it down. You will not be tested on this. It's called a dramatic symphony, a dramatic symphony. For example, he composed in 1839 Romeo and Juliet, which is a piece for orchestra, chorus, and vocal soloists. He wrote 3 operas, Benvenuto Cellini, The Trojans, and Beatrice and Benedict, and also a wonderful requiem. Who else did a requiem that we know of, right? Mozart, right? And Berlioz' requiem contains some really amazing music. He knew he was a pioneer within this new orchestral sound. And it is Berlioz who said about his requiem, "I employ 4 distinct brass orchestras, 4 distinct brass orchestras, answering each other at certain distances around the main orchestra and chorus. The result of this immensity of form is that one either entirely misses the drift of the music or is crushed by its tremendous emotion. I have seen one man listening in terror, shaken to the depths of his soul, while his next neighbor could not catch an idea, though trying with all his might to do so." So some of you in this room are going to be like, wham, oh my God, listen to that sound. And some of you might not hear it. You know, I don't know how that can happen, to tell you the truth. You know, because this far surpasses anything that we have heard before. Okay, the Fantastic Symphony is for an incredibly large orchestra. Let's go that way. It is a 5-movement program symphony. And of course, as we know, this program, and he gives it to you. So when you go to the symphony and you listen to Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, you have got to read the program. Otherwise, you're totally missing it. But you guys already have an in. You know about it. You maybe don't have to read the program. But for the layperson, you must read this, because it is very important that it reflects the emotion of this symphony. And when you go there, this is what you will read. "A young musician of extraordinary sensibility and abundant imagination, in the depths of despair because of hopeless love, has poisoned himself with opium. The drug is too feeble to kill him, but plunges him into a heavy sleep accompanied by weird visions. His sensations, emotions, and memories as they pass through his affected mind are transformed into musical images and ideas. The beloved one herself becomes to him a melody, a recurrent theme, which haunts him continually." But it's not him. Yes, it is. This is an autobiographical statement. This is Berlioz. We all know it. Come on now. He was totally fixated on her. And then he goes and gets a little out there, and he goes to sleep probably for 3 days. And he wakes up, and he has this melody in his head, and it continually haunts him. And he starts writing like a maniac, and here we have a 5-movement symphony. Now, it is a very large and very colorful orchestra. Piccolos, flutes, oboes, English horn, clarinets, 4 bassoons, 4 French horns, 4 trumpets, 3 trombones, 2 tubas, a couple sets of timpani, right? But what's very interesting is how he combines it all. That's for sure. Okay, so it's in 5 movements. And what you will hear right off in the first minute or so, in the first movement, is the fixed idea, the melody of the beloved one. We hear it in every single movement, except it's going to change. And it's going to change as the program changes. The first movement, reveries and passions. And this is the program that goes with the first movement. First, he remembers that weariness of the soul, that indefinable longing, that somber melancholia, and those objectless joys which he experienced before meeting his beloved. Then, the volcanic love which he suddenly inspired him, his delirious suffering, his return to tenderness, his religious consolation. Okay? And that fixed idea, in French, the idée fixe, sounds like this. Okay? That is the idea. That is Harriet's theme, if you will, the fatal attraction theme. The second movement is a ball. And he writes this. Oops. Do we have it? We'll have to cut. Okay. The second movement is called a ball, and you do not have this in your book. And he writes this. The artist finds himself in varied situations amid a noisy party, but everywhere the beloved's image springs to mind and troubles him deeply. It's kind of a weird, it's a waltz, but there's some underlying agitation going on within this waltz. The third movement is a scene in the country. In the distance, one evening, he hears two shepherds piping to each other. This pastoral duet, the beautiful scenery, the gently rustling trees, his newly found hope in love, all combine to bring him a sense of calm. He reflects on his solitude and hopes that he will not be alone much longer. But what if she is deceiving him? There's the paranoia. Hope and fear, happiness disturbed by dark premonition. At the end, one of the shepherds is heard again and no longer answered. The distant sound of thunder, loneliness, silence. And at the end of this movement, he creates a thunderstorm with both sets of timpani, which is very interesting. It creates just this dark hover over the end of this, what is very pastoral sounding. Now, the fourth movement, March to the Scaffold. This is where things get incredibly ugly. The artist, convinced his love is spurned, takes opium to kill himself. But the dose is insufficient, and he merely hallucinates. He believes he has murdered her, been condemned, and is now watching his own execution. At the end, the first 4 bars of the fixed idea reappear like the last thought of love, interrupted by the fatal death blow. Blech! Now, what you actually hear musically, this is the coolest part. You know, so my kids would think, yeah, all right, yeah. All right? The head you can hear the head come off, but you can actually hear it roll. Okay? He actually does that musically with the string. So it's really very, very interesting. Okay, all right, now. All right, so he's been executed, and we have one more little dream sequence, and it's called Dream of the Witch's Sabbath. The artist is surrounded by ghosts, sorcerers, monsters, all gathered for his funeral. Where is he? Hell. Moans, groans, hysterical laughter, distant cries, echoed still more distantly. The fixed idea returns, bereft of nobility and shyness. Now it is a dance tune, mean, trivial, and grotesque. It is the beloved one who has come to join the satanic orgy. A funeral knell, a burlesque parody of the plain song Dies Irae, which means what? Day of Wrath. A Sabbath round dance. The two tunes combine. Cool, okay. So, he kills her, and now he's in hell. All right, so let's see how this is done musically. And those of you out there, I have for you the fourth movement, March to the Scaffold. And I really, this is not very long, so if you can listen to it all the way through, it'll really give you a good idea of how desperately different this is and how interesting. So this is Berlioz, this is the fourth movement, Symphonie Fantastique, written in 1833, short years after Beethoven's death. This is the fourth movement, March to the Scaffold. That was Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, March to the Scaffold, and Dream of the Witch's Sabbath. So we have the execution and we have hell. And that was Berlioz's depiction of his opium-induced dreams, okay? But of course, Berlioz never said it was him, so there's still that mystery. But we know, don't we, right? I hope you enjoyed that. That is very new and different music we're listening to. Daring orchestral sounds from Mr. Berlioz, and I hope you enjoyed that. And so next time, we'll come back and we will talk about Russia and the Czech Republic, talk about how nationalism influences music. Thank you.